For more now on child soldiers and suicide bombers, I'm joined by Brooke Goldstein. She's a human rights attorney and founder of the Children's Rights Institute. Welcome to our broadcast, Brooke.
Thank you for having me.
Brooke, is this something that's been going on for decades, if not more, in past wars, recruiting children and using them as weapons?
Absolutely. I mean, the use of children in armed conflict is as old as armed conflict itself. But what we are seeing that is new now is the use of the child, him or herself, as the actual weapon. You know, the difference between, for example, a child suicide homicide bomber and a child soldier is that when you recruit a child soldier and brainwash and indoctrinate them, the goal is to turn that child into a killer, but have that child live to fight another day. The goal with the child suicide homicide bomber is to kill the child as well as the innocent civilians in his or her wake. And we saw, for example, as far back in the early 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War, where Iran sent young children to walk in front of tanks in minefields to explode the mines so the tanks could go through. And basically now in every Muslim majority country, we have a systemic brainwashing and recruitment process that targets innocent Muslim children and teaches them to revere jihad, to revere martyrdom for the sake of Allah.
So has this gotten to be more of a problem since ISIL became in the news?
The problem has really exploded, so to speak, with the Palestinian Arabs. They have been recruiting young children basically since what's called the Second Intifada. And the Palestinian Authority has, their techniques have now been copied by other terrorist groups. They publish cartoons and music videos and textbooks and sticker albums and so on, targeting children and teaching them to become suicide homicide bombers. We saw this tactic, for example, copied by the Turkish Ministry of Religion just this past March that published a children's cartoon teaching children to go and become terrorists. So it is a problem we've seen for many years and now unfortunately is spreading. What we're also seeing now is the targeting of children by groups like Boko Haram, because don't forget the child is also the weapon, but you also see child victims. The largest number of victims, for example, were children in the Turkish wedding attack. And Boko Haram targets innocent children learning in schools for the crime of a Western education.
So you mentioned cartoons. How else does this happen? Do they go to villages? Do people sell their children? What is the process?
Well, I always caution that we have to study each instance of a child suicide homicide attack on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes the children are drugged. Sometimes the children, as is the case, for example, with Hamas or with terrorist groups in Iraq, are detonated by remote control. Two young children were driven by an adult, were strapped in the backseat of a truck, driven to a coalition force checkpoint, and blown up by remote control. Sometimes children don't even know what they're carrying are explosives. In Afghanistan a couple years ago, a 6-year-old child was caught. The child was told his belt, if he pressed a button, would explode flowers. And the child in his innocence went up to Afghani police and said, I forget where to press. And he was then arrested. And so each case is different. Sometimes the Taliban, for example, pays up to $12,000 per child to encourage parents to donate their children for these such attacks. So there's a myriad of horrific techniques that are used to abuse children.
Well, Brooke Goldstein, we certainly appreciate all your work and what you've done to highlight this despicable act of terror. We thank you with the Children's Rights Institute. Thank you so much, Brooke.